In this video I'm going to review the Auto Takumar 35mm f2.3. It's a lens I've owned and used for many years, and it's proved to be a wonderful source of inspiration and enjoyment, including a couple of big surprises I'll talk about later. The lens was made between 1958 and 1963, and it has 6 elements in 5 groups with 10 aperture blades and a cocking lever. With a Pentax film camera, the lever enabled photographers to select a stop-down setting, but look through the lens and focus wide open. Then when you press the shutter button, the shot was taken stop-down. It's a unique-looking lens, large and fast by contemporary standards, with a very large expanse of glass at the front. Just how large the lens is can be seen if you look at other Takumar 35mm lenses sold around the same time. Firstly, there's the much smaller 35mm f4, made between 1958 and 1959, with a preset aperture mechanism. And then there's the Auto Takumar 35mm f3.5, made between 1959 and 1962, a diminutive lens that also has a cocking lever. This was replaced in 1962 with the Super Takumar 35mm f3.5, with an auto manual switch rather than a lever. I've got an early-ish Model 1 version of this lens. Here it is on a Pentax Spotmatic 2. Comparing these two lenses side by side, you can see how large the f2.3 lens is and how large its front element is. With so much glass at the front, glass that can suck in so much light, you'd expect it to produce extraordinary images, and you won't be disappointed. This lens has a lot of character. Before looking at the f2.3's optical performance, I should add that slightly different versions were sold over the years of production, with differences in f-stop markers and differences in the colours of distance engravings. The early versions, if you're interested, apparently had white markings and no half f-stops. I should also say that despite its size, the lens is not particularly heavy. Indeed, at 305 grams, it's around 20% lighter than the 35mm f2 that followed. The main reason it's not very heavy is because of the large empty space between the front element and the other elements. So let's move on to the lens's optical performance, starting with the lens stop-down. Well, it's good in terms of sharpness, colours and contrasts. It does show a slight vignette on my full-frame sensor camera, but nothing dramatic. It does benefit from a hood, helping reduce light leaks and improve contrast. However, on full frame, the hood I use has proved to be a bit of an issue. As you can see, the vignette is more pronounced, even though the hood is not particularly narrow or deep. On a 1.5 times crop sensor, the vignette doesn't show up at all with a hood, so that's something to bear in mind. Leaving this aside, the images are pretty sharp in the center and reasonably sharp edge to edge, certainly good for a lens of this age on a modern digital sensor. I'll zoom into and across a couple of full-frame images straight out of camera so you can see how they look. The lens is prone to dramatic flaring sometimes if the sun's out and you get the right angle of attack. And you can see the impact of the 10 aperture blades, which I find more pleasing than lesser bladed lenses. It doesn't always flare. I've got examples of images where flaring is not apparent, even with the sun in the frame. The colours can be a little cool and may need a colour contrast boost, but the images can handle quite a lot of processing. I don't see much chromatic aberration stop down. Wide open there is some purple fringing, but it's not too bad. The 10 blades produce a nice starburst stop down, if you're into that. I'll freely admit it's not a lens I'd use as a first choice general walk-around lens. I'd take a good modern prime or zoom covering this wider angle. Nevertheless, my copy is a perfectly decent performer stop down. Turning to the lens's wide open performance, this is where things start to get really interesting, because the lens is capable of producing extraordinary, eye-catching bokeh. The lens has a minimum focusing distance of 0.5 meters, which is okay. I sometimes prefer to use the lens wide open on a 1.5 times crop sensor camera, or crop mode on full frame, as it gives me more of a fast 50 framing. However, the lens is still very interesting on full frame or crop. One of the main reasons why the bokeh is so eye-catching, I think, is due to the unusual shape of the highlights, or bokeh balls, towards the edge of the frame. If you look at this image taken on a full-frame camera, you can see how the round bokeh balls at the center of the image become distorted quite quickly as you move away from the center. The shapes are rather odd. They look like squashed ovals, like oval shapes that have been flattened on the outside. That's quite usual for lenses to distort round bokeh balls into other shapes as you move away from the center. But normally the shape is more of a rounded oval shape, without a flattened side. To demonstrate this, here's a comparison of the same lights between the Takumar and a Helios 44-2. The difference in shapes is very noticeable. The Helios 44-2 is hardly a conventional straight bokeh lens. However, the Takumar makes the 44-2's rendering seem rather normal in comparison. When you take this effect outside, you can see what happens. With this shot taken on a crop sensor camera in the springtime, it's one of my favorite shots for the lens, and one I spent a lot of time processing to accentuate the effects produced by the lens. In particular, you can clearly see the unusual highlight shapes. It's like they're surrounding and encroaching onto the central subjects. It's all rather busy, but also rather artistic at the same time. As you can tell, the creation of distorted shapes away from the center happens pretty fast, so when you're using a crop sensor, you're still going to get these interesting effects. I've got other examples here. Most lenses would produce nice bubble bokeh in these scenes. However, the Takumar's distortion of the bubbles adds something extra to the image, and it looks a little swirly as well. Overall, a different and unusual effect. And if you zoom into some images, you can also see strange but rather beautiful artifacts within the smaller bubbles. Moving away from bubbles and how the lens handles out-of-focus highlights, I'd say the lens is commendably sharp wide open at the center, especially if you give the images a contrast boost. The transitions from into to out-of-focus areas are good, and I've got a few images to demonstrate the lens's sharpness and those transitions. I should add that you can stop down a little from f2.3 to sharpen up the lens more and still get these effects. The out-of-focus blur, where there are fewer highlights and artifacts, well, the blur fits into that interesting and unusual category again. It's certainly busy, but curiously I don't find it too distracting. It sort of fits in with the overall feel of the image. And wide open, at the right angles and in the right light, the lens also flares in quite an artistic way, with light flooding into the image. One other attribute I'd like to mention is that the lens performs very well with extension tubes, and is capable of lovely sharp results with smooth blur in the right situations. So in conclusion, I'd say that wide open, the lens produces images full of character, and unique character. I'm not sure I've used another lens that renders quite like this one, and it's a lens that ranks amongst my best bokeh monsters. Now, at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that the lens has two big surprises. The first surprise is that if you unscrew the front element, something that's easy to do without any equipment, you can use it as a macro lens. It focuses to around 8.5 centimeters from the front of the lens. It's not as sharp as a real macro lens, but it's fine if you stop down, and it's fun to use. Even stop down, the bokeh is nice and smooth. It's certainly an interesting feature if you have any concerns about the lens's normal minimum focusing distance. The second surprise is how easy and effective it is to reverse the glass in the front element. You need to use a lens spanner wrench, and the glass element unscrews easily, so then you can turn it around and screw it back. It's an expensive lens, you need to be careful, but the front element is so far away from anything else, no harm is done. The beauty of this particular lens is that once you've reversed the front element, it takes amazing photos. I've reversed the front and rear elements on other lenses, and the results can be a disappointing smudgy mess, especially when even the center of the image looks blurry. However, that's not the case with this lens. The center retains a very satisfying sharpness, while around the center, the lens produces a beautiful ring of swirly effects. This ring always appears somewhere away from the center. Outside the ring, there is blurring to the edges that appears to show movement, movement away from the center. You can have a lot of fun finding and playing around with the right composition to take advantage of these effects. I'm still practicing after all the years of owning the lens. When I bought my copy of this lens, I think it could justifiably be called a hidden gem. It wasn't very expensive compared to the prices it now commands. I actually got the lens more out of curiosity, given its relatively fast speed and the enticing look of that large front element. There wasn't a lot of information about it online, and in the reviews that had been posted, the photographers clearly weren't as interested as I was in the lens's wide-open rendering. Today, the lens has definitely been discovered by many more people, and is quite expensive for an old M42 mount lens. I went back and read more recent reviews online before completing this video, and it's a lens that owners wax lyrical about. Some are clearly in love with it. Phrases such as strange and beautiful and characterful bokeh, bokeh that is swirly and a little frenzied, a lens that lets light in, like a waterfall if you let it, all of which I agree with. Personally, while I'm in awe of the lens, I don't take it out all the time. I tend to save it for special occasions, when the light is right and I'm in the mood for something different. Or I'm looking for inspiration indoors, as a conventional 35mm lens, or when I take the front element off for an unusual close focus shot. Something different is definitely how I'd describe this lens. I'm a very proud owner, and despite the relatively high market prices, I think on balance it's worth it, because the lens is so unusual and extraordinary compared to other old and modern 35mm lenses. I'm also very interested to read what you think of the lens if you own one, or you're thinking of getting one. Please add your comments below, and until the next time, all the best.